Now, let's get some analysis. We're now joined by Professor Siphamandla Zondi, Professor of Politics and International Relations at the University of Johannesburg. Prof, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Good afternoon, and good afternoon to the viewers.
Now, Prof, there was some level of optimism last week when Russian footage showed what appeared to be Russian troops pulling back from some of the borders, but the G7 group of rich nations saying that they had seen no evidence Russia reducing its military activity in the area, and that they are remaining very gravely concerned, I believe is the word that they used, about the situation. What's the latest in the Eastern Europe?
It seems the standoff still continues because on one side, NATO has not made guarantees that it will expand into Ukraine and therefore expand eastwards beyond their historical domain, which is Western Europe, which is, of course, obviously read as aggressive towards Russia, as intended ultimately to bring Russia down. And on its side, as you indicate, Russia has withdrawn some of its troops, kind of toned down its activity there, perhaps to try and create room for the two sides to talk. But it seems to me that, especially the NATO side, is so consumed by the need to victor, by the need to be triumphant in the air, that it may not be providing a release for the pressure of bars so that we can de-escalate this conflict, because no one gains from it. The whole world economy is affected by it, and both sides are ultimately responsible for the suffering that arises from that.
Now, Prof, there seems to be some appetite from the Ukrainian President Zelensky. He says he's willing to meet Vladimir Putin for a peaceful settlement. Now, give us some context. Now, the question is obviously, what does Russia really want? Is this really about Ukraine's ambitions in NATO?
The principal thing is that Russia seems threatened. The expansion of NATO, which has been taking place for about 18 years now, has got to the doorstep of Russia. If you were to think about it, if you had an enemy, and the enemy was out in the other city, and then you hear the enemies on the outskirts of your city, it's only natural that you panic. It's only natural that you want to defend yourself. So what the government in Ukraine does and does not do has a direct bearing on Russia's sensitivity in relation to its national interest. And you should remember that a big part of Ukraine speaks Russian, so culturally the same group of people, and that the Russian politicians do play this game from time to time to try and signal to Russia something that they've got to be closer to NATO, or to play the game with NATO that it go a little closer to Russia. And so in the end, Ukraine has a huge role to play in de-escalating this, because Ukraine stands to lose the most if this conflict continues, this standoff continues. There doesn't need to be any conflict, by the way. This standoff on its own is damaging. So it is wise of the leadership in Ukraine to seek an amicable solution, have a conversation. And that conversation would be meaningful if they assure Moscow that they are not going to join NATO, and that NATO is not going to expand to Ukraine, because that escalates the conflict.
And of course, I'm listening to you, Prof, and one has to wonder who's actually telling the truth here. I mean, is Russia's concern, as you've put it, justified? I mean, just last week, Biden was clear that unlike World War II, which was, according to him, a war of necessity, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia would be seen as a war of choice. Just what are the implications on Russia by the West if they went ahead with this invasion?
Let us clear this. the talk of a Russian invasion of Ukraine is something that might happen in the future. Currently, what is causing problem is this. NATO is expanding to the point where it will border Russia and their enemies. And Russia is concerned about having its enemy right on its border because it might be invaded. That's what it thinks. Because the West had all long expressed its need to bring Russia under its fold. So Russia knows what the West is looking for. What is very clear is that Russia, even in its aggression, it is driven by the need to protect itself. It's perhaps sometimes an exaggerated fear of the violation of its space that might be coming. And Russia's concerns are a lot more reasonable because Ukraine is the last point before the Russian border. But the West's concern is very strange that a country 11,000 kilometers away is concerned about what is happening in there as if it affects them. How does it affect the Americans? Except that they see it as a hegemonic game about spreading democracy and spreading their system and ensuring that the victory in the Cold War is sustained. It's just an unnecessary war. And I know that the Americans and the military-industrial complex stand to benefit if there is war. They always benefit in every war, failed or successful war. They benefit. I know that the Democrats tend to be, more than the Republicans, tend to be the ones that take America to a war because the war somehow sustains the internal political currency. And what I sense, the Europeans who are closer to the situation are more interested in finding an amicable way for Russia to withdraw its troops on the basis of assurance that NATO will not escalate. Because NATO's move is an escalation, and Russia's amassing of troops is a form of escalation. You can't ask only one side to de-escalate. NATO must also de-escalate and provide breathing room for Russia to also de-escalate. Both sides must de-escalate at some point, but it must not be a unilateral, one-sided thing. And the Western propaganda, the West has a lot more influence on what we think, is that they are dealing here with a bad boy and all that. But they are also bad boys. What is NATO doing on the borders of Russia?
Very interesting. And I mean, Prof, to your point, the U.S. has also been accused of somehow promoting this falsehood of an imminent attack, even though we know that, as you've said, that Russia does have these fears. Now, let's talk about our country, South Africa, through Minister Naledi Pandor saying it's monitoring the situation in Ukraine and that it is concerned. What would instability in the Eastern Europe mean for South Africa and for Africa at large in particular?
A quick one on what you said earlier on. Have you noticed that almost all major Western countries are asking their citizens to leave Ukraine?
I have.
That's very telling. So they want to launch a war where their own citizens won't be affected. Whose citizens must be affected? The Ukrainians and the Russians, who are actually the same people. And the people who are going to fund this war and make money out of this war don't want even a single one of their citizens to be affected. Completely unfair. Now, how does that affect us? It affects the entire global economy. It has affected capital markets, affected currencies. It depresses an economy at a time when it's trying to build back after COVID-19. We are part of the same economy and we are affected very, very directly. We have trade relations with Ukraine, trade relations with Russia. The last thing we want is a war between them or war on their soil. We will all lose. The only ones who won't lose are the major war contractors in Washington, in Pentagon, who made money in Afghanistan, made money in Libya, made money in Iran, and made money in Iraq, because they can make money in war. We can't make money in war. So we are the biggest losers.
Prof, thank you so much for your time. Always a pleasure speaking to you, and thank you so much for your analysis.
Thank you.